I lay on my kitchen floor for almost 6 hours before I let myself call my son. And it wasn't because I couldn't reach the phone. It was sitting right there on the counter above me the whole time. It was because some part of me had decided a long time ago that needing help was the same thing as disappearing. And I would rather have stayed down on those tiles until morning than prove myself right. I'm telling this now because a woman at the community center asked me a few weeks ago why I always seem to have an answer for everything. And I laughed and told her the truth, which is that I didn't, not for years, and that the year I stopped pretending I did uh, was the best one I've had since my husband died. And she asked me to write it down for the group, so here it is, for her and for anyone else who needs to hear it. My name is Margaret. I'm 71. My husband, Frank, died 6 years ago, quietly in his sleep, the easy way, if there is one. And I have lived alone since then in the same house we raised our son Nathan in. And for most of those 6 years, I ran that house and my own life the way I ran everything for 40 years before that, which is to say, I did not ask anyone for a single thing I could possibly get by without. I want to explain where that came from because I don't think you're born believing that asking for help is a kind of failure. I think somebody teaches you that, usually a mother. And mine taught me well. She raised 4 kids through years that didn't have a lot of room in them for softness. And her rule, spoken plainly more than once at our kitchen table, was that you handled your own business and you did not go around airing what was wrong with you because the world would use it against you if you let it. And I believed her completely. And I built my whole life on top of that one sentence without ever once checking whether it was actually true. I think about my mother more than I expected to, writing this out. She lost her own husband young, raised the 4 of us mostly alone, and I remember watching her once, maybe I was 10, standing in our kitchen with a stack of unpaid bills she didn't think any of us had seen. And when my older sister asked if she needed help, she said, "I need you to go outside and play." And I remember understanding, even at 10, that the correct response to trouble was to make sure nobody watched you have it. I loved her for her strength my whole life. It took me 60 years to understand that some of what I called her strength was actually just her fear, dressed up nicely enough that a child would mistake it for a virtue and copy it faithfully. Frank used to tease me about it gently, in the way he teased me about most things. He'd catch me struggling with a jar lid or a ladder I had no business being on at my age, and he'd say, "Margaret, there is no medal for doing it alone." And I'd laugh it off every time. And some part of me quietly believed there was a medal, that I just hadn't been given mine yet, and that the day I finally needed someone would be the day I stopped being the woman everyone counted on and started being the woman everyone had to account for. Nathan and I had a hard stretch a few years after Frank passed. I said some things at Frank's memorial about how Nathan hadn't visited enough in his father's last year, and I said them out loud in front of people because I was grieving and angry and I did not yet have any better way of carrying either of those things. And Nathan, who had in fact been dealing with a job loss and a marriage that was falling apart that same year, things I hadn't asked about because I don't ask, took it about as hard as you'd expect. And we went almost 2 years speaking mostly in holiday phone calls that neither of us really wanted to be on. There was a specific Christmas in the middle of that stretch that I still think about. Nathan called. We talked for maybe 11 minutes, mostly about traffic and a casserole recipe. And after I hung up, I stood in my kitchen with the phone still warm in my hand, and realized neither of us had once asked the other how we were actually doing, not really. And I remember thinking clearly that if either of us had asked honestly, I did not have the first idea what I would have said back because I had not asked myself that question either in longer than I could count. I want to be honest that I told myself during those 2 years that the distance was fine, that I had my garden and my books and my Tuesday bridge group, and all of that was true, and none of it filled the specific kind of quiet that comes from knowing your only child is out there in the world and doesn't especially want to call you. I told people I was independent. I did not tell anyone that independent somewhere along the way had become a nicer word for alone. The fall happened on a Tuesday in February. Ice on the back steps I'd been meaning to salt for a week, and I went down hard, reaching for the railing that wasn't quite where I remembered it being, and I knew almost immediately something in my hip was wrong. The specific wrongness of it, a pain that doesn't shift no matter how you try to move around it, and I lay there on the cold kitchen tile, having crawled in from the porch on my forearms, looking up at my own telephone on the counter like it was on the other side of a river. I want to describe those 6 hours, honestly, because I think that's the part people skip past when they tell stories like this. The part where nothing dramatic is happening except a woman arguing with herself on a floor. I told myself I'd rest a minute and get up on my own. Then I told myself I'd wait until the pain settled and get up on my own. Somewhere around hour 3, lying there, cold, embarrassed in a way that had no audience but myself, I started doing the math on what calling Nathan would actually cost me, and the answer my whole body gave me immediately was that it would cost me the story I had been telling about myself since I was a girl at my mother's kitchen table. Somewhere around hour 4, I started thinking about Frank's voice. There is no medal for doing it alone. And for the first time in 6 years since he'd said it last, I let myself actually consider that he might have been telling me something true rather than just being kind to me. I thought about lying there until morning, and I thought, with a clarity that frightened me more than the hip did, that if something worse happened in the night, the last thing my son would ever know about me for certain was that I hadn't called him. Not that I couldn't, that I hadn't, and I did not want that to be the last true thing about me. I called him at what must have been 9 at night. He picked up on the second ring, and I heard in the half second before I spoke how much bracing he did just to answer a call from me, and I said, "Nathan, I've fallen, and I think I need help." And I want you to understand that those were, without exaggeration, some of the hardest words I have said aloud in 71 years, harder than anything I said at Frank's funeral. Because at least at the funeral I'd had righteousness to hide behind. On the kitchen floor, I had nothing to hide behind at all. He was at my house in 22 minutes, and I know it was 22 because I watched the microwave clock the entire time, and when he came through that door and saw me on the floor, something in his face broke open in a way I had honestly never seen before. Not fear exactly, more like relief mixed with a grief I think he'd been carrying about me for longer than I'd ever let myself notice. And he knelt down on that cold tile in his work clothes and said, "Mom, why didn't you call me sooner?" And I told him the truth, which was that I hadn't wanted him to see me like this. And he said very quietly, "I would rather see you like this than not see you at all." And something in me that had been braced for about 6 years finally let go. The hip was broken, a fracture that needed surgery, and then weeks of a rehabilitation facility I did not want to go to and fought about for exactly one afternoon before I understood I had no actual choice in the matter. And I want to tell you honestly that the first week there was miserable, not the pain. The pain was manageable, but the specific misery of being fed and bathed and reminded to use my call button by strangers in a body that used to run an entire household without help from anyone, and I cried in that bed more than once quietly when the aides had gone because the loss I was grieving wasn't really my hip. Nathan came every single day. I want to say that plainly because I think it's the actual turning point of this story, more than the fall itself. He came every day for 6 weeks, sat in the ugly vinyl chair by my bed, and somewhere in the second week, out of boredom or courage or both, I started actually telling him things. I told him about the 2 years I'd spent quietly grieving his distance and calling it independence instead. I told him what I actually meant at Frank's memorial, underneath the anger, which was that I had been terrified of losing my only son the same year I lost my husband and hadn't known any way to say that except by attacking him for not being there enough. He told me things too, things I hadn't asked about in years because I don't ask, about the job loss, about the marriage that had ended quietly the year after Frank died, about how he had needed his mother that year more than at almost any other point in his adult life, and had gotten instead a woman standing at his father's casket, accusing him of not caring enough. We both cried in that ugly vinyl chair situation more than either of us expected to, and I want to be honest that it did not fix everything instantly. Grief and pride do not resolve themselves in a single hospital conversation, but it was the first true conversation either of us had had with the other in longer than either of us could actually count. When I came home, Nathan had already arranged for a woman named Grace to come by twice a week to help with things I couldn't manage yet: groceries, some light cleaning, a ride to physical therapy. And I want to tell you honestly that letting Grace into my house the first time felt like a small death, watching someone else load my own dishwasher. And I sat in my own kitchen that first afternoon and made myself stay in the room instead of retreating to pretend I didn't need the help. And by the third visit, Grace and I were talking like old friends. And by the sixth, I had told her things about Frank I had never told anyone, not because she asked, but because staying in the room with my own need instead of hiding from it had apparently loosened something else in me, too. There was one woman in that rehab facility, a physical therapist named Denise, barely 30, who caught me apologizing for the third time in one session for needing her to steady my arm, and she stopped, looked right at me, and said, "Margaret, you don't owe me an apology for having a body. That's the whole job. Let me do my job." I didn't have a response ready for that, which is rare for me, and I thought about her sentence for days afterward. Turning it over the way you turn over something you suspect is more true than you're ready for. I started going to the community center not long after, at first just for the physical therapy group, and then, almost by accident, for the coffee afterward, where a handful of us sat around admitting out loud in front of near strangers what our bodies and our years had taken from us. And I discovered something I would not have believed at 65, which is that saying I'm struggling with this out loud to a room full of people does not make the room think less of you. It makes half of them lean forward and say quietly, "Me too." And I had spent so many decades protecting myself from a humiliation that it turns out almost nobody in that room was actually waiting to hand me. Nathan and I talk every week now, real conversations, not the holiday kind. He brought his new girlfriend, a warm, direct woman named Priya, to Sunday dinner a few months ago. And at some point in that dinner, I heard myself telling her, unprompted, about the 6 hours on the kitchen floor. All of it. The pride, the fear, the specific shame of nearly choosing a broken hip over a phone call. And Nathan reached over and put his hand on mine while I told it. And I understood, telling it, that I was not performing humility for anyone at that table. I was simply no longer willing to be the only person in my own life who knew the whole truth of me. I still catch the old habit sometimes. Last month, a different neighbor offered to help me carry groceries in. And my first instinct, even now, even after everything, was to say, "I've got it." And I stood there for a second with two full bags cutting into my hands and made myself say instead, "Actually, that would help a great deal, thank you." And it was such a small sentence, and it still cost me something to say it. And I think that's the truest thing I can tell you about this whole subject, that finding strength in being vulnerable is not a door you walk through once and are done with. It's a door you have to keep choosing to walk back through, sometimes daily, sometimes over something as small as a grocery bag. I don't know that I have a tidy lesson to hand you at the end of this, and I've come to believe the tidy lessons are usually the least honest part of stories like mine anyway. What I actually have is this: I spent most of my life believing that the strongest version of me was the one nobody ever saw struggling. And I was 71 years old, lying on a kitchen floor in the cold, before I finally understood it was the opposite the entire time. That the strongest thing I ever did in my whole life was let my son see me on that floor and ask him out loud to help me up.